3 weeks before the night that ended them. Vivian Ashford threw a glass of water in my face in front of the entire company. I should explain how I had earned it. I had corrected her. Not loudly, not cruelly. We were in a run-through of the second act, and she had skipped a line, an important one. The line the whole scene turns on, and the stage manager hadn't caught it. And so from my place at the edge of the rehearsal room, where the understudy sits and says nothing, I quietly gave the line. Just said it, the way you hand someone a thing they've dropped. The room went still. Vivian turned and looked at me as if a chair had spoken. "What did you say?" She said. I gave the line again. "It's the cue for the reversal," I said. "Without it, the scene doesn't land." She crossed the room, picked up the water glass from the props table, and threw the contents in my face. Slowly, almost lazily, the way you'd water a plant you resented. "When I want the spare to talk," she said, "I'll wind it up." Nobody laughed, but nobody helped me either. That is the thing to understand about the Mercer Theater before any of the rest of it. There were 40 people in that room, and not one of them moved. Because Vivian Ashford was the star. And this was Julian Mercer's production. And I was the understudy. And an understudy who gets water thrown in her face is supposed to wipe it off and apologize for existing. So I wiped it off, and I apologized. And I watched Julian Mercer, the director, the man whose family name was carved over the front doors, watch the whole thing from the back of the room and say nothing. Because Vivian keeping the spare in her place was useful to him. I'll come back to why it was useful to him. That is most of the story. My name is Nora Vale, and I had been the understudy at the Mercer Theater for 6 years. 6 years of learning every role in every production so completely I could have played any of them that night, in any costume, without a missed beat. 6 years in the wings while someone else stepped into the light. 6 years of being the spare. You do not last 6 years as a spare unless something keeps you there. Talent doesn't keep you there. Talent gets you out. I was better than Vivian Ashford, and I say that flatly because it is simply true. I knew it. And more dangerously, a few people in that building knew it. And most dangerously of all, 2 of them had spent 6 years making very sure it never mattered. Because here is the thing that should have been strange. That I had stopped letting myself find strange. Because some questions are easier not to ask. In 6 years, I had auditioned, quietly, for 7 other companies in the city. Good ones. Companies that would have killed for someone who knew the entire canon cold. And 7 times the door closed. Not a no. Worse than a no. A silence. A canceled appointment. A lost application. A casting director suddenly and regretfully unavailable. Every single time. For 6 years. A woman who knows every role in the city cannot get seen anywhere in the city. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens on purpose. With money and effort. And nobody spends money and effort burying a nobody. I dried my face. Vivian went back to her scene, skipping the same line again because she would never take a correction from the spare. And as the company filed out that night, Julian Mercer stopped beside my chair. He didn't look at me. He almost never looked at me directly. I'd noticed it years ago and never understood it. "Don't correct her again." He said, "Not ever. You're here in case she's sick. That's all you are." He paused and added something he didn't need to add, something that told me more than he knew. "The day we don't need a spare anymore is the day you're gone, so pray she stays healthy." It was a threat. But if you listen the way I listen, it was also a confession. He needed me to never go on. My whole value to him was in staying invisible. A spare who actually performed was not an asset to Julian Mercer. A spare who actually performed was a problem. I filed that away with everything else, and I went home. And I did not yet know why he was so afraid of the spare stepping into the light. I was going to find out, and so are you. Over the next 2 weeks, they tried to break me 3 times. And the pattern is the story. So I'll walk you through all 3. The first was the schedule. An understudy has the right to a put-in rehearsal, a run where you walk the role on the real set, so that if you ever go on, you don't injure someone by not knowing where the trap door is. It isn't a courtesy, it's a safety requirement. Mine kept getting canceled. Celeste Vane, the theater's manager, the woman who controlled every schedule in the building, canceled my put-in 4 times in 2 weeks. Always with a reason, always at the last minute. Vivian needs the stage. The crew's behind. We'll reschedule. They were not behind. They were making sure that if I ever did go on, I'd go on blind and fail. A failed understudy is a forgettable understudy. A failed understudy never becomes somebody. So I learned the set without the rehearsal. I came in at hours when the theater was empty, told the night guard I'd left something, and walked the stage alone in the dark, counting steps, finding every mark, learning the rake of the floor and the exact place each light would fall, until I knew that stage in pitch black better than Vivian knew it lit. They denied me the rehearsal. They could not deny me the building. The second thing was the role itself. Word came down, through the stage manager, that the understudy was no longer to attend the lead's private scene work. New policy, which meant I'd miss the final shape of the part, the director's last adjustments, the changes that come in the last 2 weeks and matter most. So I learned those from the wings. From the sound of it, the half-heard direction, the actors' bodies through the gap in the curtain. By opening night, I knew Julian's final version of that role better than Vivian did. Because Vivian argued with his direction, and I simply absorbed it. The third thing was the cruelest, and it was Vivian's. She found out, somehow, that I'd once had a sister who acted. She didn't know the details. Nobody did then. I'd buried that part of myself so deep, I'd half hidden it from myself. But Vivian had caught some thread of it, and one afternoon, in front of the company, she used it. "I hear the spare comes from theater people," she said, loud. "Performing for the room. Some failed actress sister, was it? Ran her career into the ground and disappeared?" She smiled at me. "Must be genetic. The Vale girls and their little tragedies." I said nothing. I'd trained myself over 6 years to give that room nothing. But something cold and final happened in me when she said it. And I think now it was the moment the watching turned into the waiting, and the waiting turned into a plan I didn't yet know I was making. Because Vivian had just told me something. She'd said failed and disappeared and ran her career into the ground about my sister. And she'd said it carelessly, the way you repeat a thing you've heard, which meant someone had told her a version, a specific version, the one where my sister failed on her own. And I knew, in my body, standing there while 40 people watched me absorb the insult, that the version was a lie. My sister had not failed. Something had been done to her. And the carelessness with which Vivian repeated the lie told me she didn't even know it was a lie. She was just a mouth repeating what the machine had decided was true. The machine, Julian Mercer, Celeste Vane, the same 2 people who'd spent 6 years burying me. I went home that night and took out the few things I'd kept of my sister's, and I began, quietly, to remember, on purpose. The Mercer Theater keeps its history on its walls. Every lobby, every corridor, Framed programs and photographs going back decades. The famous productions, the famous faces. The company walks past them every day and stops seeing them. I'd walked past them for 6 years. 6 years ago, when I started. I'd been too raw, too careful, too frightened of my own reasons for being there to really look. But 2 days after Vivian threw my sister in my face, I came in early and walked the corridors slowly and looked at every frame. And on the wall of the upper corridor, the one nobody uses because it leads to the old dressing rooms they don't open anymore, I found her. A photograph, 7 years old. A young actress in costume, mid-performance, lit gold, caught so alive it stopped my breath. The caption was small. A celebrated production, a name. Adeline Vale, my sister. On the wall of the theater that destroyed her. They hadn't even taken her photograph down. That is how little they feared her memory. Her face could hang in their own corridor and mean nothing to anyone. I stood in front of it a long time. And then I did the thing I do. The thing none of them knew about. The thing that was the whole secret of me. I didn't take notes. I didn't photograph it. I looked at the small print beneath the photograph, the production details, the date, the names of everyone involved, director, management, the whole list. And I read it once, completely. And I kept it, all of it, exactly. The director of that production, 7 years ago, was Julian Mercer. Footsteps. I turned, and Celeste Vane stood at the end of the corridor, watching me. And I understood from her face she'd been watching longer than a moment. She looked at me, and she looked at the photograph of my sister behind me, and something passed over her face she couldn't quite hide, a flicker of calculation, of alarm. Quickly smoothed, lost. "Nora," she said, "this corridor's not used." Just looking at the history, I said. Her eyes went, briefly, to Adeline's photograph, then back to me. And in that small movement, she told me everything. She knew who Adeline Vale was. She knew, very possibly, who I was. And she was, in that instant, doing exactly what she'd done for 6 years, standing between me and a door, making sure I never reached it. "The history's not interesting," Celeste said. "Come away from here." I came away, but I'd already seen the name, and she'd already seen me see it. We walked back toward the light of the main theater, both knowing something had changed. And neither of us said it. And the not saying was louder than anything. After that, they stopped pretending, at least with each other. And they came for me properly. It started with a meeting I wasn't supposed to hear. 2 days after the corridor. I was in the wings late, doing my silent walk of the stage, when Julian and Celeste came into the empty house to talk. And they did the thing every powerful person does, which is speak freely, because they could not conceive the spare might be in the dark 15 feet away, keeping every word. "She's been to the corridor," Celeste said. She was reading the old program. Julian. She looked at it the way someone looks who already knows. How much can she actually know? Julian said, "She was a child when it happened. Children grow up." Celeste said, "And she's not stupid. She's the opposite of stupid." That's always been the problem. 6 years and she's never once slipped, never once shown us what she's thinking. That's not a dull woman waiting for her break. That's a woman waiting for something else. A silence. Then Julian said the thing that told me how frightened he truly was. Then we end it before the show. He said, "We find a reason. Misconduct, unreliability, anything. We let her go this week, with a story attached so no other house will touch her. the way we handle these things. Then there's no understudy in the building who looks like that woman, asking those questions on my opening night. The way we handle these things, the same machine that had handled my sister 7 years ago, they were now, casually, in an empty theater, deciding to use on me. Manufacture a reason, attach a story, make sure no other house will touch her. I was listening to them plan to do to me, in detail, the exact thing they'd done to Adeline. And they didn't know the person they were planning it about stood in the dark, 20 feet away, hearing every word, keeping it. Over the next 3 days, they tried to build their reason. And this is where it got dangerous. Because a manufactured reason only needs to be believed, not true. First, a prop went missing from my station, and I was quietly accused of losing it, but I'd watched the stage manager move it himself 2 days earlier, and I told him the exact shelf he'd set it on, the exact hour, and what he'd been saying when he did it. And there it was. The accusation evaporated. I watched Celeste's face when it did, and I saw her recalculate. Then a line went around that I'd been drinking before rehearsals. A serious charge. It's the kind that ends careers and sticks. But I had 2 long-employed crew members who knew it was a lie, and, for once, were willing to say so out loud. Because the one thing I'd built in 6 years of being kind to the people the stars ignored was the loyalty of the people the stars ignored. Sam from the lighting booth was one of them. Remember Sam? Then Celeste tried the cleanest trap of all. She called me to her office and slid a document across the desk, warm and concerned. All friendliness. Just a formality. Nora, standard paperwork. Everyone signs it. I'd love you to sign tonight. I read it once, completely, the way I read everything. It was not standard paperwork. Buried in the dense middle paragraphs was an acknowledgement of repeated performance failures and a voluntary agreement to leave the company at the production's end. It was my own firing. Dressed as routine, waiting for a signature that would make their lie my confession. I'd love to read it properly first, I said, smiling back, and set the pen down. I'm careful with documents. Her smile held, but her eyes didn't, and we both knew the trap had missed. Every snare they set, I stepped out of, because every snare required me to have done or known or said something, and I knew precisely what I had done and known and said on every day in every room for 6 years. You cannot frame a person who remembers the truth exactly. You can only frame a person whose memory is soft enough to doubt. Mine is not soft. That is the thing they did not know. That is the thing nobody knew. By the end of that week, they'd failed to build their reason. And opening night was 4 days away. And they were out of time. They couldn't fire me cleanly now, dismissing the understudy days before a major opening, with no clean cause, would itself raise the questions they were trying to bury. So they decided to simply get through opening night. Keep me boxed in the wings, where I'd been for 6 years, and deal with me after. When the lights were off and nobody was watching, they thought the danger was after the show. They had it exactly backwards, on the evening that ended them. The Mercer Theater was as full as I'd ever seen it. Every seat. The mayor's office. Critics from every major paper in the 3rd row. The kind of house that doesn't come for an ordinary night. The kind that comes when a theater is about to crown a new star. Because that was the plan. Tonight, Vivian Ashford became a legend. In my sister's old theater. In a role I knew better than my own name. I was in the wings. In my blacks, ready as required. Expecting nothing but 6 more hours of the dark. And then, 40 minutes before curtain, the machine broke. I felt it before I knew it. The particular quality of panic that moves through a backstage when something has gone badly wrong. Doors, fast footsteps, voices low and urgent. And then Celeste Vane came through the wings at speed and stopped when she saw me. And her face did something I'd never seen it do in 6 years. It went afraid. "Vivian can't go on," she said. I didn't say anything. I'd learned long ago the power of the pause, and I let this one stretch. Because I had waited 6 years and could give it 5 seconds.
"What happened?"
I said, "It doesn't matter what happened," Celeste said, her voice coming apart at the edges. "She can't go on. The house is full. The critics are out there. The entire season is this night." She stopped, and I watched her arrive, with visible horror, at the sentence she'd spent 6 years making sure she'd never have to say. "You're the only one who knows the part." There it was. 6 years of locked doors and canceled rehearsals and a glass of water in my face. And it all came down to this. The spare was the only one who could save them. Julian arrived then, and he was worse than Celeste, because Celeste was merely afraid, and Julian was afraid and cornered, the most dangerous way a powerful man comes. He looked at me, finally, directly, the way he'd avoided doing for 6 years. And I understood at last why he'd avoided it. Because looking at me directly meant seeing my sister's face. And he could not afford to see my sister's face tonight, of all nights. "You go on," he said. "No, thank you." "No, you're ready." A man giving an order to a thing he despised and needed. "You go on. You say the lines exactly as written. You take the bow. And the second that curtain comes down, you are finished here. Do you understand me? You do the part and nothing else. You do not speak to the house. You do not improvise." His voice dropped. "You do not make this about anything other than the play. You do not make this about anything other than the play." He wasn't afraid I'd forget the lines. He was afraid I'd remember them. He was afraid of what an understudy named Vale might say. With a microphone. On his stage. In front of 2,000 people and every critic in the city. If she ever got into the light. 40 minutes. Celeste said, "Get her dressed." They walked me toward the stars' dressing room, the two of them flanking me like guards. And I let them. And I did not let them see the thing happening behind my still face. Because they had just made the mistake that ends people like them. They had taken the one person who had kept every word they ever said, and they had handed her the light. The costume fit me as if it had been made for me, which it nearly had been, because Vivienne and I were close enough in size that I'd spent 6 years being measured against her like a mannequin. They left me alone in the dressing room for 10 minutes to change, and that was the next mistake. Because the room was full of things. And I am a person who reads a room completely and keeps it, the contract on the vanity, open, unhidden. Because to them, I was furniture, and you don't hide things from furniture. A new 3-year deal, Julian's signature beside Vivian's, and near the bottom, a clause about the current understudy and the precise terms under which she was to be retained, restricted, and kept from auditioning elsewhere. In writing, the locked door of my 6 years. In Julian Mercer's own hand, I set it back exactly as it had been, to the millimeter, because I always leave things exactly as they were. And then the door opened, and Vivian Ashford walked in. I'd been told she couldn't go on. And here she was, upright, dressed, her eyes too bright. And I understood at once that whatever had happened to her 40 minutes ago, she'd decided she would not let the spare have her night. She had rallied, on will and fury, and come to take the stage back. "Take it off," she said, looking at her costume on my body. Take it off. I'm going on. Behind her, Julian and Celeste appeared in the doorway, and I watched a fast, silent war happen on their faces. Because this was a catastrophe of a different kind. Vivian, barely upright, running on nothing, was a disaster waiting to happen in front of the critics. But Vivian was the known quantity. Vivian was controllable. Vivian would say only the lines in the play, the spare, the veil girl, in the light with a microphone. Was the one thing in the world Julian Mercer feared more than a bad review. Vivian. Julian said carefully, "You're not well." "I'm well enough," she snapped, swaying very slightly, "to do my own part in my own show. I'm not handing my career to the spare because I had a bad hour." She turned on me, and there was the woman who'd thrown water in my face, 6 years of contempt in her eyes. "Get out of my costume." And here was the moment. 2,000 people on the other side of the wall, critics in the third row, a star who could barely stand, insisting on going on out of pure spite, a director caught between two terrors, and me, in the costume, knowing the part better than anyone alive, holding in my head a contract I'd just read, a conversation in an empty theater, a name on a corridor wall, and 6 years of everything they'd ever said. I looked at Vivian, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not give the room nothing. "You can't stand," I said quietly. "You're swaying. You'll get 4 lines in, and the whole city watching will see the great Vivian Ashford come apart on the Mercer stage. Is that the legend you want?" I let it sit. "Or you let the spare go on, and you keep your name, and tomorrow you tell everyone you generously gave your understudy a chance. Either way, Vivian. But choose now. They can hear the house." It was the most I'd said to her in 6 years, and every word was a trap built out of her own vanity, and I watched it close. She wavered, and Julian, God help him, made the choice that destroyed him, because he was so terrified of Vivian collapsing publicly that he chose the danger he didn't understand over the one he did. She goes on. "He said," meaning me, "Vivian, you're in no state." She goes on. Vivian Ashford looked at me with a hatred I will remember exactly, because I remember everything exactly. And then she stepped back and let me pass. Places, called the stage manager. I walked toward the light. There was one person in that building on my side, and I'd never asked him to be. His name was Sam. He ran the lights from the booth, and in 6 years, he was the only person in the Mercer machine who'd ever said good morning to me as though I were a person and not a piece of equipment. He found me in the last 60 seconds before Places, which took real courage, because Celeste was watching me like a hawk. He pressed something into my hand in the dark and was gone before she turned. An old program, 7 years old, from the booth, where he kept things, because lighting techs are present for everything and noticed by no one. The male version, in a way, of what I was. I read it in the half-dark in the half-second I had. Once, completely, and kept. It was the program for my sister's last production, Adeline Vale, the lead, and there in the cast and management list, every name I needed. The director, Julian Mercer, the manager, Celeste Vane, and beside a small administrative line, the name of the person who'd signed off on the press release that ended my sister's career. The manufactured story that branded a brilliant young actress unreliable, difficult, finished. The lie that disappeared her. I already knew the shape of what they'd done. I'd assembled it over weeks from 100 overheard fragments. But this was the spine. The dates and names that turned a thing I knew into a thing that could be checked. Sam had kept it 7 years, not knowing why. The way people who work in the dark keep things. Tonight, he'd put it in my hand because he'd watched them do to the sister exactly what they'd done to Adeline. And he'd decided he was done watching. I looked up at the booth. High in the dark at the back of the house, I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. And I knew what I was about to ask of him without asking. And I trusted the one kind man in the machine to understand. Because I had a plan now. Fully. Finally. It had assembled itself over 6 years, crystallized over 3 weeks, and locked into place in the last 10 minutes. And it required exactly 2 things. It required me to walk onto that stage and be undeniable, to be so good that the house belonged to me completely, so that when the moment came, 2,000 people would be leaning so far forward, nothing could make them look away. And it required one light at one moment from one man in a booth who had finally chosen a side. "Places," said the stage manager again. I stepped out of the dark I'd lived in for 6 years, into my sister's stolen light. And the curtain rose on the last night of the Mercer Theater as they had built it. I was extraordinary. I tell you that as a fact, not a boast, because it matters to what happened. The plan only worked if the house was mine. The house was mine inside 5 minutes. You can feel a theater lean. 2,000 people stopped coughing and shifting and reading their programs in the dark, and they tilted toward me, and they did not tilt back. I played the role Vivian was supposed to become a legend in, and I played it the way only a person can who spent 6 years studying it from the dark, who knew not just the part, but the whole machine of the play, every light, every beat, every silence. The critics in the 3rd row stopped writing and just watched. From the wings, I could feel Julian Mercer's horror grow with every minute. Because his worst case was never a failed understudy, it was a triumphant one. A triumphant veil in the light with the whole city watching. At intermission, he was waiting in the wings. His charm burned entirely off. "Pull it back in the 2nd act." He said, "Go quiet. Let it fade." He was asking me to throw it. To take the best opening night of his career and tank it. Because a triumphant spare was more dangerous to him than a ruined show, it told me. More than anything had. How frightened he was of what attention on me might dig up. "No," I said, and I walked past him to my place. Because I was done taking his direction, and we both knew it. And there was nothing he could do in the 90 seconds before the 2nd act without stopping the show in front of the critics himself. The 2nd act built toward the scene I'd been waiting weeks for. Near the end of the play, my character stands alone at the front of the stage and speaks directly to the house. A monologue. In the script, it's about love. I began it as written, word for word. So Julian, in the wings with his hand near the curtain rope, would have no cause to bring it down. The house was silent and leaning and entirely mine. And then I let the written words turn into true ones. I kept the rhythm of the monologue, the same hush, the same intimacy. So for a moment, it sounded like part of the play. And I told the house a story about a young actress, 7 years ago, on this very stage, about how good she was, about the people who ran this theater, and what they did to her when her brightness became inconvenient, and how they did it, and why. I gave the date, I named the manufactured scandal, and then I did the thing they could never have prepared for, the thing that was the secret of me, finally in the light. I quoted them, word for word, the exact phrasing Celeste Vane had used in an empty house 3 weeks before. planning to do to me what they'd done to my sister. The exact sentence Julian Mercer had spoken about handling these things. Dates, names, the line from the contract on the vanity. Not paraphrased, not approximately, but precisely, in their own words, with a certainty that does not come from invention. Because I had kept every one of those words for weeks, for years, in the one place they had never thought to lock. The house had gone utterly still. The silence of 2,000 people realizing they are watching something real break open in front of them. In the wings, Julian Mercer lunged for the curtain, and high in the dark at the back of the house, Sam did the only thing he could, the thing I'd trusted him to understand. He did not let the curtain hide me. He threw a single hard white spotlight onto me, square and clean, pinning me in light so the entire house could see the woman speaking. So Julian Mercer could not make me vanish into the dark without 2,000 people watching him try. The one kind man in the machine had given me the light my sister had been thrown out of, and I stood in it. And I finished telling the truth. You cannot unring a bell in front of 2,000 people. The curtain came down at last. But the curtain coming down changed nothing, because the thing had been said and heard, and was already moving out through the doors and into the city. 2,000 people turning to each other in the dark, asking, "Did you hear that? Is that true? Did the understudy just..." Their first move was exactly what Celeste had promised me in the wings weeks before. Call it a story, a disturbed understudy, a breakdown, a fantasy shouted by an unstable woman cracking under the pressure of a sudden debut. She has no proof, they told the critics gathering at the doors. Nothing but a wild tale. But I hadn't shouted a wild tale. I'd recited specifics, exact dates, exact names, exact words, the precise administrative trail of how a young actress was destroyed 7 years ago. Delivered with a precision that does not come from a breakdown. And exactness does something a wild tale cannot. It tells the people who do have the paper exactly where to look. There were such people, there always are. Crew and staff who'd been in the building 7 years ago, who'd known what was done to Adeline Vale, and stayed silent because the Mercers were powerful and the story was buried, and no one had ever given them a reason or a route to speak. When I stood in Sam's spotlight and laid out the trail exactly, I gave them both. The old contract from the dressing room, which a journalist now knew to ask for. The records behind the manufactured press release, which the person whose name was on it suddenly found the conscience to produce. The restriction clause in Julian Mercer's own hand. Piece by piece, the paper I'd never possessed was produced by the people my exact, public, unforgettable account had finally freed to produce it. What happened to Julian Mercer and Celeste Vane after that is a matter of record. Handled in the proper rooms by the proper people. The Mercer name came off the building within a year. The machine that had buried my sister and locked me in the dark for 6 years came apart in daylight. The way these things do, once someone finally says the exact, true thing, where it cannot be unsaid. Vivian Ashford. People always ask about... The truth is almost disappointing. She hadn't known. She'd simply never once wondered who the spare was. And her not wondering had been its own long cruelty. But she was not part of what was done to Adeline. She had only ever taken the light and never looked into the dark beside it to see who was standing there. The last I heard, she had finally learned my name. It took 6 years and the collapse of everything around her, but she learned it. And Sam, the one kind man in the machine. When new people took over the building, the first thing I made sure of The one favor I asked of all the attention that suddenly wanted to make me a story was that they understand who'd run the lights that night and why he mattered, and that he never want for work again. He kept a program for 7 years not knowing why. I think I know why. Some people keep things because they sense, without being able to say it, that a day will come when the truth needs a witness who didn't throw it away. I understand that better than anyone.
People ask if I planned it all.
The 6 years, the dark, the patience. I didn't. I came to that theater at 22, barely understanding my own grief, drawn to the place that broke my sister the way you press a bruise to feel it. I took the only job they'd give me. I had no plan. I had a wound. And the one thing about myself I'd always thought was a curse, the head that keeps everything, the memory that will not let a single word go. The reason I'd never been able to heal, because I could never forget. It was not a curse, it was a case, building itself one kept word at a time, for 6 years, in the one place they never thought to search. They put me in the dark because they believed it made me nothing. But the dark is where you see them. The dark is where, if you're the kind of person who keeps everything, you become the most dangerous person in the building. And no one knows until the light comes up. So if you're the one they overlook, the spare, the assistant, the quiet one in the corner they speak so freely in front of, I'll tell you the only thing worth knowing. They are handing you everything, every day, because they cannot imagine you matter. Keep it and wait for your light. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known better? Subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. I'll see you there.